Thanks, Ken. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming. This is really exciting. It was interesting. Ken emailed me earlier today and said, oh yeah, I forgot to ask you to get me your bio. So it was either the 50-word bio or the long one that I knew he'd edit down. And it was interesting in putting it together to look at it and see that now it's been 12 years since we worked on the Portland Green Streets manual, which was really one of the first documents that an agency in the US did around green streets. And there's a lot that's happened in the 12 years since then. So it's nice to come back to this and have an opportunity to talk about green streets, particularly when it's actually raining, which is a key tie-in to why we would want to think about green streets. So what are green streets? It's the idea that we can integrate the streets in our urban areas with the urban context, but also with the natural environment, that we can design streets to function more as part of the natural environment. As Ken said, there are reasons that we want to do this very obviously from a water quality standpoint. These are the kinds of things that you see after that first flush or after a good period of drought. Where you will get just all of this debris trying to get into the storm drains, and as Ken said, often going right into the bay. It's also about localized flooding. Our storm drain systems don't always perform the way that they might need to just from an engineering standpoint, and we can get generally localized flooding happening. And I think particularly with the kinds of storms that we're seeing increasingly, we're going to see more high volume storms and probably see more and more flooding. There's a whole regulatory and policy framework to this. There's a reason that jurisdictions go about doing this. When we say that we worked on the Green Streets Handbook for Portland, everybody tends to think, oh, well, that makes sense. Portland, Oregon, of course, they would be thinking of doing something like that. But when we worked on the manual, there were specific federal regulations, state regulations, impacts to endangered species that were forcing them to deal with these issues about the water quality coming from their streets, because salmon and other endangered species spawn in the urban creeks of Portland. So they had to improve the water quality, and that's why they were looking at it. Philadelphia, because they have combined sewer systems. So there's a lot of regulation that's leading jurisdictions to looking at these issues of green streets and how to deal with water quality. We're under the same kind of regime in terms of these policies. In San Mateo County and in the city, there's some opportunities to look at some of the watershed issues, localized flooding. The San Mateo County actually has one of the more recent and really state-of-the-art design guidebooks for green infrastructure, the Green Streets and Parking Lots document, and I'll be using some examples from that this evening and talking about green streets. So we have this water quality issue that we need to deal with, and there's different ways that we can deal with it. We can engineer our way out of it if we wanted to by just building more storm drains, using filters on those storm drains to improve water quality. But one of the things that we've learned over time is that these can be very expensive pieces of infrastructure to build and maintain. Green infrastructure has the potential to be more affordable in terms of capital cost and potentially even in terms of ongoing maintenance costs. It can be more effective in some cases, but it can also help achieve other community goals. And this tension, what has been really laid out, I think, in the engineering world and from a policy standpoint, is a bit of a tension between green and gray infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily need to be that. And there are more jurisdictions that are looking at these issues and finding hybrid approaches. Last year, I was doing work for US EPA, going around the country doing presentations in jurisdictions. Cities applied for technical assistance, and we go out and provide this technical assistance. And the area that I was focused on was green streets, and really about operations and maintenance of green streets and how to get public works departments and parks departments working together with the water department to implement these systems in an effective way. And in Dayton, Ohio, they were doing some really interesting work. Dayton, Ohio is doing some cutting edge thinking about green infrastructure. They're updating their citywide water plan, and in doing it, they asked the consultants to look at opportunities to implement green infrastructure, but look at the cost implications. So they've done studies looking at sort of case studies in different parts of the city where there are water quality or flooding issues, and exploring what's the right mix of green and gray infrastructure. So this is one neighborhood that they looked at, a historic neighborhood. Underneath that asphalt is brick paving. Originally this neighborhood had brick streets. You can see there's about a 2 to 3 inch gutter there, and that's because over time they've just continued to lay down asphalt. But there are issues with flooding here, and they wanted to look at some different approaches. So one thing that they looked at, and I'll talk a little bit more about this technique later, is the idea of repaving with porous pavement. And then underneath, they can design the roadbed and the other infrastructure that's underneath the road to increase water storage capacity. So rather than building a big concrete pipe or trying to probably have to take down a couple of the historic houses to build a detention basin, they're looking at redoing the streets as a way to improve the stormwater system in the area and fit it to the context and do a kind of mix of green and gray infrastructure to achieve that goal. There's also a set of things that green infrastructure can achieve related to general smart growth or community livability goals as well. You can be more efficient with the use of the land, you can use natural processes. As I said, it can be more cost effective. Why are we looking at this issue? What is it about urbanizing that has led us into building cities, that has led us into this? This is the natural water cycle. If you think back to sometime probably in elementary school or middle school, you were taught about the water cycle. It rains, lands on the ground, eventually it percolates through, works its way into waterways, evaporates, forms more clouds, rains, and that's the sort of natural cycle. Well, what happens with urbanization is we affect the concentrations of flows, we add pollutants, we raise the temperature of the runoff, and do all these things that affect that natural cycle. So these diagrams from the county plan get into some of the details of this. What is sort of a more natural situation? How does absorption, the plants using the water, evapotranspiration going back up into the atmosphere, creating clouds, and that cycle that we're talking about. But this is what happens when you urbanize. You concentrate flows, you get them into pipes, you're not recharging groundwater, you still have evaporation and things, but you're really seriously affecting the more natural system. So the idea of green infrastructure, and it's not just within streets, you also can look at green infrastructure within private development, green roofs, those sorts of things, is taking the way that we live in our cities and build in our cities and trying to make it function more the way that the natural systems have tried to do. And a lot of this is about the introduction of more landscape. And it's because of the introduction of landscape that we can get at other goals that communities have. The city of San Mateo, in thinking about this issue of sustainable streets being the combination of complete streets and green streets, is sort of the new cutting edge of thinking about complete streets, more complete streets, how to really integrate these two ideas so that they're more effective. Because the introduction of green streets concepts into the streets, providing more healthy landscape, providing more landscape, in general, can improve the use of streets for all users, support economic vitality, and a whole set of other community goals. So let's look at what some of those aspects are. So here you see the simulation of some improvements to a state highway in the city of San Leandro. So by improving the landscape, changing the cross-section of the road, we can make it better for bicyclists, better for transit. It still functions well for vehicles. But we have more landscape and more trees. One of the things we heard from developers who might look at building on underutilized properties in this corridor was that improving the street, adding landscape, was one of the most effective things that the city could do to encourage them to develop in this corridor, transforming it from an auto-dominated corridor. Trees just in and of themselves and creating these more walkable environments, there's been research about this and more research along these lines looking at retail sales and rents. On the order of a 3 to 15% increase in home values if you look at a similar type and size of house on a similar street, with the main difference being more street trees and that more walkable environment. Similarly, retail districts will show higher sales when you have a walkable, well-landscaped street environment. The streets are a nice place to hang out. I'm going to go there and meet my friends, and I might end up spending more money while I'm there too. So it makes it a more attractive place. And there's also a relationship to landscape and having access and views of landscape in terms of employee happiness. Placemaking, this idea of enhancing the quality of our cities and the special places within our cities. Landscape in streets is an important part of that. Reducing carbon footprint, reducing the temperature of urban environments, all of these things can help with carbon and climate change issues. Public health. We've all heard about this more and more, the idea that active transportation is something that we really need and that can help the health of our communities. The idea of 150 minutes of moderate activity per week as a way to improve your health. Well, making more walkable streets is an important part of that. Less than 10% of Americans currently achieve that 150 minutes. The last couple of weeks, I haven't been biking to work, and I'm feeling not achieving those 150 minutes. There are other environmental and urban habitat issues related to greening streets, the urban forests, some of those benefits of reducing temperatures in urbanized areas, providing linkages to parks, all of these kinds of issues as well. But there is also the side of reducing water demand. There's this idea of what's called water harvesting. I've done this kind of work and I'm doing this kind of work in the desert Southwest, and that tends to be the way that they talk about what we call green infrastructure, is it's about harvesting the water to use it for the street landscape. And in the kinds of rainfall patterns that we're going to be seeing in California, I think that aspect of water harvesting is going to be more and more important. For our work on the Sustainable Streets Plan, we've been starting to think about what are the types of green design elements that can integrate into the sustainable streets. So I'm going to run through some of these. One of the basic components is what's called a rain garden, and this is a very adaptable concept. Rain gardens can be large, like you see in this public square in front of a city hall, or they can be more linear and along a street in sort of the tree lawn area between the sidewalk and the curb, or they could be out in the parking lane and integrated into bulb outs like you see here. And those of you that were at the Complete Streets talk, the idea of bulb out shortening crossing distance, those also create great opportunities for introducing green infrastructure, and that's what you see here. The vegetated swale, this is a more linear form of green infrastructure, something that you may have seen. It's tended to be the more typical type of structure on Delaware Street here in San Mateo. There is that form of that linear piece of landscape. The water comes in through the cutouts in the curb, flows into that, is treated by the plants that are there, sediment can settle out, and you will also, where the soils work for it, you can also get infiltration into the ground and reduce total runoff, but at a minimum you want to spread the peak flows. It's called green gutters, the idea that you could just take a narrow space between the travel lanes and what would be typically the curb to have the water flow off of the street and again slow down, have the chance to be taken up by some of the landscape and a little bit of treatment. You can also do more urbanized treatments. This idea of linked tree wells is that you can have these smaller rain gardens with trees in them. Maybe have pervious paving in between and the sidewalk, so you're getting some water going down in. And then what happens is you can put a perforated drain pipe in between these rain gardens, and these are linked underground so that you're getting increased water storage. Spreading the peak flows is a really important aspect of doing green infrastructure. And so you can see in the sketch at the top, that's one of the projects we've done in Arizona. And they get very high peak rainfall. So you can even extend the water storage under the sidewalk or out into the street along the lines of what Dayton, Ohio is looking at. Infiltration, trenches or basins or wells, if the soil and hydrology will work for you, you can recharge the ground system and the groundwater system through some of these if the water will actually percolate well. A lot of areas in San Mateo have that sort of muddy bay soil, and you're not going to get this kind of infrastructure, but there could be places where this can work. Trees, just in and of themselves, are an important part of green infrastructure. In the work we did in Portland, there's a whole supplementary manual about trees and how they can function as part of the stormwater system. Selecting the right species, so just the leaves or needles of the tree can hold water and allow it to evaporate or at least slow down the flows. The bark of the tree can slow down the water flow. And then of course, the trees can pull up a lot of the water through their roots. So a really important part of thinking about green streets. Something that's sort of in that realm of is it green or is it gray is permeable paving. But there are really effective ways to use permeable paving, both within the street. Here's an example in the parking lane of having permeable paving. You can do it in sidewalks, and as you saw in the Dayton, Ohio example, you could go across the entire street. So there are different stormwater functions that different pieces of this this green street strategy, these different elements can work. Just some of those more technical stormwater functions, the infiltration, retention, slowing down the flow of water, treating the water. And different ones of these elements of the green street will function better for different purposes. But then also when you start thinking about these being integrated into the street, they fit into different parts of the street as well. As the design techniques for green streets have really been advancing over the last 12 to 15 years, one of the issues that's really become apparent is the issue of operations and maintenance. And we've talked a bit with City of San Mateo about this, and we're hoping through the work that we do that we can advance the discussion on this. And as I said, it was really the focus of the work that I was doing for US EPA. Because what happens is now we're taking landscape within the roadway, that if a city has a forestry department or a parks and rec department, they will typically end up maintaining those. Sometimes it's a division of public works, but that can be, it's increasingly rare that that's the case. Also, cities in general now tend to not have enough funding to maintain trees. So we come into cities and talk about greening streets, and you get certain departments going, oh my God, what are you doing? We can't even maintain the trees we have, the landscape we have. But it's providing a stormwater function. So is it possible to engage the water department or another side of public works and change the way that money flows within the city, and sometimes even between agencies that might have different boards and might be not directly connected through local government. So there's a whole aspect of getting more efficient and multiplying the investment, finding the appropriate people to do these, and really having to structure new operations and maintenance plans. But as some of the cities, the larger cities in the country, who really under order from US EPA are having to aggressively look at these stormwater issues, they're more and more advancing information about operations and maintenance. So there's great manuals and increasing experience in making these things work. There's another aspect of green streets about thinking about them as part of the open space system. Thinking about streets as part of civic space of cities. Typically in a city, public right-of-way and streets is about 25 to 30% of the total land area of a city. And over the last 40, 50 years, we've been busy about turning that over to automobiles. And now people are starting to rethink, wait a minute, this is an important part of the civic space of our cities. So how can we think about streets and green streets, linking parks, and even providing recreation space for our neighborhoods and commercial areas? We need to think about the context that we're designing in. Different design details, different green street elements make sense on different kinds of streets and in different parts of our cities. Are we in the downtown, in a mixed-use corridor like El Camino Real, or are we in a residential neighborhood? And then even what kind of residential neighborhood? What is the feel of the neighborhood? How can we develop these appropriately? I wanted to touch on one aspect of the implementation side and start talking about some of the opportunities for being more efficient and doing some creative things in our cities. There's tended to be this issue in thinking about stormwater that once the rain falls on the ground, whoever it fell on owns it. And it's their responsibility to treat it and manage it. So if water falls on private property, a city or a water quality board will say, okay, private property owner, you need to deal with the volume of flow off of your property, the water quality of it on your property before it comes into the public system. Increasingly, we're seeing cities being given the responsibility for doing something about the water that falls on their streets. But again, it tends to be deal with your water from the streets, on your streets, or on other public land. But then we have smart growth policies that are saying, well, let's densify, let's do infill, let's do things that are a little bit more dense, but oh, by the way, you need to have some water retention on your property, so sorry, you're not going to quite achieve that density goal that we were hoping for. So increasingly, cities are looking at opportunities to do public-private partnerships. And when we were working for EPA, we did a little bit of research into this. And Fort Collins, Colorado has been doing some of this. One of the people in their public works department thought about this idea, convinced the rest of the city administration that they should do some case studies of trying to do this with private developers in their downtown where they were trying to encourage mixed-use infill. And I think now they've actually developed a policy to allow this in a lot of other areas of the city. So what they did is they worked with a developer and said, well, we'll allow some of the water that you would normally have to treat on your property to be treated within the street. They did permeable paving in the parking. There's water storage underneath that. There are these rain gardens to do some treatment. And roof drainage actually comes right into those rain gardens and is piped into that reservoir underneath the parking to slow the total flow off of the property. And then they worked through an agreement. The developer built the infrastructure. The city subsidized it a bit. The developer indemnified the city for most stormwater related claims that might come up. The building owner maintains the landscape, the roof drains, under the sidewalk, and all of the sub-drains, but ultimately the city is responsible for the long-term replacement costs. And so they've looked at all of these cost aspects and came up with an approach. Another thing that we found in doing this EPA work is it's really easy to go into communities when it's raining and find missed opportunities. This is Dayton, Ohio again, and they had done this redevelopment of a street in a historic district of their downtown about 7-10 years ago. Great brick street, these great bulb outs with brick. You go out and look at it, happened to be raining. So there's water puddling in the street. If they'd only done pervious paving. They might have been able to avoid that. They didn't adjust the crown of the street. So you can see along the sidewalk, there's water puddling there as well. So again, if they'd been able to do something with pervious paving and under drains, it might have helped that. Here's that seam between the new brick paving and the old concrete. And then there's a planter. Lower the grade and put a cut in that curb and just do a little bit more careful grading, and they would have been able to do it. Then you go on the street side, and there's the storm drain that has the no dumping seal on it, flowing right into the storm drain rather than into the planter. So it wasn't the way that they were thinking about it at the time that they built and designed this, but you can easily go into places and look around and see where, gee, if we'd just done things a little bit differently. So you need to be opportunistic, and that's one of the main things I think that's a benefit of thinking about sustainable streets that combine complete streets and green infrastructure. A lot of times the question becomes, well, where's the right opportunity for us to do a green street improvement? And I really think it is almost at the level of it's really any time you're rebuilding something. If you can, if you can avoid having the water going into that planter and maybe undercutting some of the surface, if you do the subgrade, treat the subgrade correctly, it's really just about digging a little bit deeper to do that, setting the finish level of the soil a little bit lower, and cutting a connection. You need to be careful that it's going to function all right. But really, if you have a tree and you can get water to it from this runoff, that just is a much easier way to go about things. So from the work that we did, I wanted to show just a few more examples. From the work that we did in San Francisco for the Better Streets Plan, this is Fillmore. It was one of the streets that we looked at, and since the plan was done, they actually now have a complete and green streets plan for rebuilding Fillmore. So hopefully sometime in the next 5 or so years, we'll see Fillmore transform from something that looks like this into something that looks a lot closer to this. And actually they did end up deciding to do some dedicated lanes for bus as well. But you can see some of the complete streets improvements, bulb outs to shorten distances across the street. But then you can take that bulb out and integrate green infrastructure into it. Put in trees that can take advantage of having the storm drainage go into their planters and providing that irrigation and being healthier trees. Even in the Sunset, which is not known for great streetscapes, I don't think, there are some opportunities. And so some ideas here, you can do traffic calming and have landscape in the middle of the street. Maybe here, rather than that idea of green gutters, it's a pervious paved gutter. So allowing the stormwater to come into the gutter and percolate in. Taking the apron of the driveway and doing pervious paving on that. Taking the planting area, and again, lowering it a bit. And see what can happen here in the reconstruction of this is from that edge of the pervious paving to the edge of the planter, you just have to come in and trench through that and do some soil treatment so that you can get more volume for water storage. It also creates more airspace so that it's healthier for trees and the landscape. So you're building upon a basic move that's to deal with water quality and creating a healthier landscape. So those are really the ideas of what we mean by green streets. A couple of other things to touch on, just thinking back to the examples that I showed you. As you're going around San Mateo or wherever you live, look at the streets that you're on and what sort of landscape is there. When do you find yourself on a street and you kind of relax? Is there something in the landscape that's helping you with that? You can see here, just having those flowers, having a sense of season, creates a better pedestrian environment. And that pedestrian environment is what's key to complete streets. And making this investment in landscape and having it serve these multiple purposes, I think is really a new promise and a new way of thinking about making our streets more sustainable, making our cities more sustainable. So that's it in terms of presentation. And hopefully you all have some questions or ideas or things that you would like to talk about.